Hi, Net. Are you able to hear me? No, I have to speak into this.
I
Yeah?
can hear you. Yes. Can
Yes.
you hear me?
On the system, maybe we can do a check. So I will disconnect on my computer and try and do it on my system. Yeah? Um, hi, Net. Could you just say hello?
Yes. Hi, Anita. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Joe. I can see you. Will you just say hello?
Hi, Anita.
Just to check if this is working. So let me just give me a second. I would just take, yeah, I can see Nath and I can see Joe. Just a second. Give me a second. So, good morning to all. Thank you for coming in early. We had a very, very interesting 2 days at the CSTD, and we are at a moment that I think is quite significant, considering that we have negotiations around the Global Digital Compact that is in progress. And of course, we anticipate with great enthusiasm the WSIS Plus 20 review. Today, we have with us 4 experts, and the dialogue with them will focus on building an economic justice playbook for WSIS Plus 20. Although it's about a playbook, it's not play. We know that it is mired in geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. So just to give you a very, very quick couple of minutes orientation to what we may expect in the room today, we want to focus on, take you back to the WSIS processes, which was an important point of departure for envisioning an information society that, as we know, and as the refrain goes, that is people-centered and development-oriented. Yet, 20 years into the digital epoch, we stand at a crossroads. And all of us have our theories, I think, about where we are, but we could, of course, agree on a certain common minimum baseline about the digital arena. Connectivity, platforms, data, and AI have become a very, very highly contested terrain, with their gains accruing disproportionately to powerful actors in the landscape. The rules in the digital arena are shaped by a political economic regime that's skewed against the majority world. And this is something that UNCTAD reports on the digital economy have repeatedly underlined. I'd also like to zoom in on the other international rule-based regimes, particularly in trade and intellectual property, to underscore that free trade agreements are often used to deny developing countries the ability to have access to algorithms. This means while data and various services value chains flow out of these countries, AI capabilities are retained by transnational firms of certain countries. More insidiously, trade secrets are often invoked incorrectly and misused to lock up, aggregate non-personal data, often from public statistical sources, open government data sources. In fact, societal data, like behavioral data that may not even really qualify for trade secrets, are also in the enclosures of big tech corporations. This means the innovation economy is starved of the raw material needed to build AI. And the absence of a governance regime for data and AI that addresses questions of the data commons and the enormous social and public value captured in private enclosures is really the roadblock for development, and also seems to be a fait accompli presented to developing countries. There is a global dynamic here of misrecognition rooted in underrepresentation in the AI context, but also maldistribution rooted in economic injustice. We are staring at data inequity that inhibits the majority world's right to innovate, the appropriation of the data commons for proprietary AI, and a totalizing control of national public infrastructures, including undersea cables, by just a handful of corporations. And these are public infrastructures of today. International taxation regimes have given a free pass to digital behemoths, depriving nations of precious fiscal resources, even as debt and economic crises have imposed extraordinary hardships on common people. So, from international trade and IP rules to taxation and financing, international economic law impinges on local possibilities for transformative digital change, and we do not hear of these debates very often in relation to the global digital transformation agenda. Despite legal measures and policy changes for market regulation and data governance at national and regional levels, and we do indeed acknowledge that in the past 20 years, many positive developments have taken place at national and subnational level, the international status quo is far from fair and just. So we need to reboot the vision of the information society and ask a few very hard questions. How can public and social value be recentered in the digital society? What would it take to make issues of economic justice paramount in the WSIS Plus 20 agenda? And how can multilateral governance move towards longer-term institutional frameworks? We need global democracy. So this is what we propose to address, and we have an excellent set of people to address this. We have Andrea Esther-Hewson, who may not need an introduction to most of us. We have Abdul Muhit Chaudhry from South Center, which is an intergovernmental organization. We also have online Net Dano from the ETC group, and we also have Joe, who speaks from People versus Big Tech. So what I will do is try and divide the conversation and be of assistance to the experts to take this through 3 rounds. We will do a scorecard round first, just to get the scorecard. We will then do a vision quest round to vision again. And then finally, we will end with a brass tacks round to say what next. So to jump in directly, I'm going to pose the first question to Andriette. To ask you, Andriette, are current policies able to address the challenges that confront us? Has the human rights regime, as we know, worked for economic justice in digital society? And are all countries really on an equal footing in the digital society?
Thanks, Anita. That really 3 challenging questions. I think the answer is yes and no to all of them. It's working. I think that what WSIS did give developing country governments was this grand global vision. And I think that it really galvanized a belief within the global South that it's possible to harness the potential of ICTs for local economic development. And I think the structure of WSIS, because of the action lines often being linked to line ministries, actually made it relatively simple for governments to look at food security, to look at education. So I think the framework was there. I think it did not work that well in many places. I think partly because of mechanisms that you outlined, which, global inequality, but I think very much because of simple day-to-day things like governments are not good at working across departments. They're not good at internal collaboration. You often have political processes that intervene with interdepartmental collaboration and implementation coordination. I think that other sort of trends sidetracked with this implementation, such as the assumption that mobile telephony will solve all the connectivity challenges of the world, and that by just leaving it up to markets, we would connect everyone. And of course, that made a huge difference, but market failure is a reality in many developing countries. And at that time, from the policy perspective, I think in many countries, they didn't have necessarily the right policy tool set to respond. You also had the trend in many countries, dating back to the 1990s, but really reinforced by WSIS, to privatize telecommunications before it was liberalized. To put that differently, that that the telecommunications infrastructure and services became private before there was a competitive environment. So you had this transition from public monopolies to private monopolies, the big MNOs. So these were all factors that made a difference, and not such a good difference. I think, has the human rights approach work? I don't think that, in fact, we are still really applying human rights in the way that we need to, which is with all human rights being indivisible and interconnected. And that includes economic and social and cultural rights. And I think the human rights application has worked in the sense that it created this quite bottom-up thrust for people to realize that their right to speech, their right to political participation, the right to hold companies accountable and to hold governments accountable and criticize government existed on the internet, and they fought for that. I think, unfortunately, many regimes responded in very authoritarian ways. And that, again, it shifted the attention of many global South countries from actually creating an enabling environment of strengthening economic development to an environment of control, where they control use of the internet. So I think where I would differ with you, I think the structural inequalities that you outlined absolutely exist. I don't think that excuses governments. I think a lot of the failure is actually at the level of global South countries who do face enormous constraints. One you didn't mention, which is debt. And I think we completely underestimate the impact of the increase in debt and the debt crisis on government's inability to invest sufficiently in ICT infrastructure. But at the same time, I think as technology has evolved and costs have come down in many respects, I think many countries have failed to actually take proactive action at the local level, work collaboratively with local businesses. Of course, the taxation issue is a major issue. The tax regime of the global platforms is completely unjust. But I don't think that is a sufficient reason for not expecting more from our governments in the global South. I think they have the ability, they could take more proactive action. And I think, speaking as a civil society person, I think we should be holding them accountable for that. And I think what we need to be cautious about is that when we challenge the global regime and demand that the global regime becomes more democratic, and I agree with you, we shouldn't do that at the expense of challenging our governments at the local level.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I did mention debt. I think it's something that cannot be overlooked ever in the United Nations context, considering the historicity of how we came to be the UN. And I think also in the context of governments, the focus of the discussion was really not so much on national governments. And I agree with you that a lot can be done at the national levels. But I think it's important to understand the interplay between geoeconomics, geopolitics, and national policies. And I just want to cast the spotlight on that very sweet spot. So I will now go to Joe. Joe, are you able to hear me?
Hi, Anita. I can hear you well.
Yes. So Joe Westby from People versus Big Tech. The questions here, we are already seeing very nice heating up of the debate. So would you think current policies have been able to address the challenges? And do you think that human rights law works? And what about the relationship between big tech and national governments? Over to you.
Thanks, Anita, and thanks for the opportunity to be speaking to you all here today. So I think really following on from what Henrietta said, I think where we find ourselves now is that the current model of the digital economy globally is broken and dysfunctional, with a handful of big tech companies and other multinationals reaping enormous profits while presiding over a growing set of harms to people, society, and markets. And I think the root cause is the unprecedented power that these gatekeepers have been able to acquire over the last 20 years. And that's also enabled them to thrive on toxic and exploitative business models, which harm workers, destroy the media and our information environment, and disproportionately impact people from marginalized communities in the global south. I think the reasons for that are, in the 20 years since the World Summit on the Information Society, this situation has been allowed to happen through, on the one hand, a very laissez-faire approach by governments to regulation over the tech sector, which, although we have seen some improvements in the last few years, is still very much the case, as well as an overall failure by governments to tackle the ever-growing concentration of power in the global economy to a small number of multinational corporations. And that's not just in the tech sector, but elsewhere in the economy. And you asked about whether human rights has been able to do enough. I mean, I think that there has been huge strides to improve how human rights law and standards is able to hold big multinational companies to account through, the UN guiding principles and other instruments, and then we're seeing those being picked up through national and regional level laws. But I think still very much the case that these multinational companies are not largely held accountable for their human rights abuses. And I think going back to the tech sector, with the current AI hype bubble that we're in at the moment, there's a real risk that this will only get worse. Already the AI space is dominated by these same tech giants. And I think at the moment, policies are still too focused on tackling the symptoms of these problems, such as countering disinformation, protecting children's rights. And although those are all extremely important, they don't address the root cause, which is really taking on the concentrated power over these big tech players on the infrastructure of the digital economy and the platforms that we all rely on day to day.
Thank you very much for that. On that note, I would like to invite Neth Dano. Neth, you work on biodiversity, food systems, and concentration of power of corporations. I would very much like you to bring in a perspective from ecology and livelihoods to the debate. Over to you, Neth.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. I'm happy to speak with Joe because many of the premises and assertions that he presented were actually be echoed in my response to the three questions. I wish I could answer like Andrea, yes and no, because it's for me it's no, no, no for the three questions. And as mentioned by Anita, much of my experiences and also reflections on the questions on digital justice, economic justice are actually based on what we have been doing research on and advocating for in the area of food, agriculture, and biodiversity at such a group. Like we've been looking into agricultural digitalization for years. and also the impacts and potential impacts to food systems. So first, no, as mentioned by Joe, we really have to look into the reality that there is so much inequity, so much imbalance in power, not just in the tech sector, but across sectors, in particular food and agriculture. Like it's really shocking, like to see how corporate concentration, corporate consolidation has actually unfolded from the time WSIS started. I'm just referring it to the timeline, not because of WSIS, not because of that, but looking at this from the 20-year timeline of WSIS, for example, like we have seen how top tens that control the world market in like how many 20 sectors across food and agriculture have actually shrunk, no, like really from 10 to 8 to 6 to 4 that we have now. For example, like if you look at the seed sector, about 62% of the global market for seeds is just in the hands of the top 4 corporations. And this the same top 4 corporations who actually control the seed market globally are the same corporations that control how much? About 70% of the agrochemicals market. And it gets worse as you go down the line. Farm machineries, agri pharmaceuticals, livestock, and all that. And of course, you cannot just say this is about concentration of capital in the hands of a few, or acquisitions and mergers have been going nonstop over the past 20 years. You have to look into the technology that enables this. Like as the Geneva Plan of Action of WSIS actually aimed not to make ICT useful, to increase efficiency in food production, increase access to information, will actually go into a deep reflection on who actually benefited over those access to digital information, to ICT, whose efficiency in terms of food production was gained from all these technologies. Definitely, it's not the small scale food producers, it's not smallholders, it's not small fishers, but it's largely industrial food system players, largely dominated by transnational corporations that are getting bigger and fewer over the past two decades. I think we really have to really go deep into this to be able to understand and answer the questions that are posed in this panel. Like as we go forward into the negotiations for the global digital compact, we cannot just say that everything is okay and we just deal with rights in the cyberspace or even digital divide without accepting that at the very root of the so-called digital divide is development divide. Look at it across sectors, it's really an issue of development divide, like in food and agriculture. The difference between South and North and also the players within food systems are actually very, very stark. And I think the whole floodgate opening towards the deployment of agricultural digitalization in the past 5-10 years, I would say, has actually even strengthened or aggravated this inequality. Like the issue of rights of farmers is barely discussed when you say human rights with regards to environment or economic justice. No, like the even the whole definition of human rights is very, very narrow, not even taking into account rights that are very particular in the space of food, agriculture, and biodiversity that are already enshrined in UN documents. Like if you go into the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, the Convention on Biodiversity, free and prior informed consent is deeply enshrined there. But who talks about free and prior informed consent of communities to data? You know, the even free and prior informed consent in terms of accessing farms, like siphoning all this information without knowledge, without even information provided to governments, not even farmers who are the custodians of this information and these knowledge systems, are not even discussed. Like to me, like for those of our working on food and agriculture, it's really quite shocking, like how these big discussions on digital rights seem to assume that all the other sectors will just have to conform with generalities when you discuss rights, when there are actually well-established rights that are even enshrined in UN documents that are barely discussed. Like there's not even granular discussions of how economic justice actually pan out in the whole discussion of digital justice, and it gets far worse and far more real and grounded if you go look into this across sectors. And also, like if you look into I think Joe mentioned about this, like that unless we address the root causes, like this is just going to be one document after the other, like WSIS and Global Digital Compact. We need to address the root cause of of the inequalities that we are experiencing right now. Of course, mentioning and recognizing acknowledge that such inequalities occur and happening, and need to address those inequalities, inequalities in power that are actually behind the broken system that we have. Because like hearing about the broken economic system that Joe is talking about, like we hear that like a broken record, broken food and agricultural system. But which system is broken? It's actually the industrial food system that is broken, that is actually contaminating the peasant food system, which is not barely being discussed in this whole discussion of technology, digitalization in agriculture. So lastly, I think we also have to deal with enclosures. Anita, I think referred to this in the introduction. There are new enclosures that are being imposed, whether explicitly or implicitly. It's not just it's on top of the existing enclosures, such as intellectual property rights, no, enclosures with regards to privatization of data, and also enclosures with regards to limiting the capacity of those on the ground, those in the margins, to be able to benefit from their own like the exchanges and across generation, the development across generation of seeds and knowledge systems, which are now being marginalized even more because of the deployment of digital technologies in agriculture, which has become the obsession of many countries, particularly developing countries, like without even a proper analysis and assessment on whether these technologies are appropriate and what kind of implications will it have on livelihoods, on biodiversity, on food and agriculture, just because there is also a big push globally for these technologies, for governments and countries to be able to deploy them without proper assessment or evaluation on whether these are appropriate at all. So I end my take on the first round of questions.
Thank you so much. Just wanted to also point out that ETC's research pointed out that in the future markets, where large grains trading happens, it's AI that's helping the few companies to buy up all the stocks, even as we're talking about hunger and poverty around the world. So when we talk about AI for social good, we shouldn't be looking really at applications at the national level alone, but also what really happens in these future markets trading. I also want to point out that the ability of developing countries, and before we come to the next round on the vision, recently in Buenos Aires, in the court, the judge asked for a particular facial recognition technology algorithm to be opened up and asked the vendor to submit the algorithm to the court. The vendor said, this belongs to the mother company, the parent company that is in the first world, and there is a trade secret on account of which he cannot share this with the local court. 3 weeks ago, in the city of Lagos in Nigeria, Uber and the city government had a very, very big face-off. Lagos said, in 2020, we had an agreement to share real-time data. All the other cab services, ride-hail services, have been submitting real-time data. And Uber, you are not doing so. So they wanted to impound all the vehicles and take them off the road. So the city authorities tried to exert their power, and Uber came to their knees and said, give us 3 more months. The question is, why should domestic companies follow the rule and Uber as a transnational company not follow the rule? And what really happens to the EU's and the OECD's supply chain, business and human rights responsibilities? So these are some of the political economy questions with which we go into the second round. What should our policy visions factor in? And we really want you, Abdul, to tell us a little bit more about the taxation regime. We know you have a presentation. We will pull that up. Thank you.
Anita, I hope you can all hear me. As mentioned, from the South Center, which is an intergovernmental think tank of 55 member states. And I'm happy to actually see 3 of them here, Brazil, Cuba, and Iran. And we really try to support developing countries in having a fairer global economic system. And in particular, the work I look after is on a fairer international tax system. And I want to start, before I get into the presentation and responding to the questions which Anita has raised, I want to start with a fundamental point which all of us as developing countries should be aware of. The international tax system is one of the few aspects of the global economy where developing countries have the power in their hands. If you look at the international investment system, as developing countries, we're trying to get investment from the developed countries into our countries, from the capital exporting states. We don't really have the power in our hands. In the international trade system, we are often seeking market access to the developed countries. We don't really have the power in our hands. But the international tax system is one of the few areas where the power is in our hands. Any country can tax multinationals and foreign companies in any way as it wants, unless it is restricted by a tax treaty. Tax treaties don't grant taxing rights, they restrict taxing rights. And the entire international tax system has been devised by the global north to restrict the taxing rights of developing countries as much as possible. So this is something we should really keep in mind. Any country can tax foreign income however it wants, unless restricted by a tax treaty. Now with that, if we can go to the first slide, I want to build on the comments which my co-panelists had mentioned, starting with the point by Andriette about what can we do at the national level as developing countries, given that we also have a debt burden. So connecting that to the point on Uber and Lagos, which Anita had spoken about, I want to talk about an anecdote, an experience we had in one of our member states, Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka came to us and said, we need help in figuring out how to tax Google and Uber and all of these other tech companies because we really need the money. We are in a debt crisis. So we went to Sri Lanka, we did a workshop, and you had some of the Sri Lankan businesses there as well. And one of them was a local version of Uber. And he came up to us and said, you guys have come way too late. We should have had this a long time ago because we are paying taxes and Uber is not paying any taxes. And how can we compete with Uber given the existing advantage they already have? So one of the first things we need to look at in terms of a policy vision is a level playing field. We need to make sure that the foreign companies pay as much taxes, at a minimum as much taxes as our domestic companies are paying. At a maximum, we can even consider high taxes, discriminatory taxes, aimed to keep the foreign companies out, to provide a safe environment for our companies to rise. And let's be very direct about this language. The global south need not be shy about being protectionist. We need not be shy about being protectionist when the global north is blatantly protectionist. Why shouldn't we try to create a safe environment for our companies to rise? And when we talk about big tech, the reality is that big tech is actually US big tech. The vast majority of the big tech market is monopolized by a handful of American companies. Even, of course, the developing countries are suffering, unable to have their own tech companies to the same extent. But even the developed countries, many European countries are suffering as well. The US threatened trade sanctions on Italy, on Austria, on France, on Spain, on the UK, when they tried to tax American tech companies. And speaking of the Americans themselves, they're not benefiting either. Amazon in 2018 derived $11 billion in profits and paid zero in income taxes to the US. at least 55 companies, American headquartered multinationals, have paid zero in taxes in 2020, including Nike. Many of you might have Nike shoes, FedEx. Many of you might have used FedEx to send stuff, Hewlett Packard, and so on. So this is really a game where it is a few who are really benefiting at the expense of the many. So this is policy vision number one, a level playing field. At minimum, the foreign companies pay as much as our companies, and at a maximum, the tax regime designed to provide a safe environment for our companies to grow. It is a completely legitimate demand, which is done all the time by the developed countries themselves. Next slide, please. The second question is, what are some concrete positive agenda for global digital justice? So, I want to start with a quote by one of my friends who says that my innovative financing solution is called paying your taxes. We don't need to endlessly come up with some new solutions. We just need to focus on the basics. If the big corporations can pay zero or minimal taxes again and again, let's fix that. We don't need to come up with some complicated new financial model which ends up benefiting a hedge fund or a bank. We need to just focus on getting the basics right. We need to make sure that big tech, which is mainly US big tech, pays its fair share of taxes, which, as Andriette was saying, can give our governments the money we need to provide the public infrastructure, the digital public infrastructure, and to give the power back to the state. And the second positive agenda which we should have is to stop or even reduce the wealth accumulation of the big tech barons like your Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and so on, because these individuals have now, they can control the destiny of entire countries. Elon Musk, through his control of the Starlink network, played a big role in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine. To just give you a single example, and there is enough on this, so I don't want to go into too much detail. Now, how we do this is what I'll come to in the next round.
Okay. I like the tantalizing next round invocation. To this round, Neth, do you have any quick comments for less than 1 minute? Because we want to bring you back on round 3. So if you have any quick comments, Neth, at this point in time, just for a minute.
Yeah, very, very quick on the vision. Like ETC Group has been pushing for the institutionalization of technology assessment at the global level. I think there was actually reference to that in the Rio Plus 20 document, and there were 2 years of the 2 sessions of CSTD that actually adopted the push for looking into the impact of new and emerging technologies before they are deployed. So there is actually this resolutions too in 2018, 2019 of the Commission on Science and Technology for Development calling for the institutionalization, that's tongue twisting for a non-native English speaker, of global technology assessment in order to look into the potential impacts of new technologies before they are deployed. I think this should also be applied not just to AI, but to how digitalization is being deployed in agriculture. Because of the impacts that I have run through in my earlier reply to in the first panel. And I think we don't have to reinvent this. As I said, there are already like some tractions on this at the UN, and pushing for this right now, I think is an opportune time as we are going into the negotiations for the Global Digital Compact. We cannot just assume that the world is ready. Obviously, the world is not ready for AI, definitely not for AGI. So why are we even pushing for rapid deployment of technologies that we already know actually result to harm on society, and also result to harm that are unknown to those who claim that they know everything. So the vision is to put a break on a societal break on the technology that we already know causes harm on society. So that's my very short take on this panel. Thanks, Anita.
Thanks so much. Recently, I was at a World Bank event and thought it useful to think about the whole idea of data flows with trust. And in their early G70 submission to the GDC, the G77 had spoken about data-free flows with equitable development. So basically, data flows with equity because trust is a consequence, I think, of equity. So you cannot put the, cart ahead of the horse. It would be interesting also to borrow from language from the climate negotiation. Common but differentiated responsibilities. So in respect of our vision, how do we see the whole question of data free flows, differentiated responsibilities? What do we do now that data availability and accessibility is locked up? So what I would like to do is to call upon Joe and Andriette. So Joe, would you like to take the question about what now for the policy vision? What do we do about data flows in respect of that vision? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to pick up on what others have been saying. I think there's a lot of overlap between the panelists. I mean, I think in terms of what the policy vision should be for the future, I mean, really, for starters, it is states need to take a really holistic approach that goes to the heart of trying to unpick the power of these big tech platforms and actually then proactively building an alternative digital economy that is in the public interest. And I agree that we can't just leave this up to the markets. States need to use kind of smart industrial policy to actually shape and create digital economies that actually serve public interests and not just private profit, which is the current state of play. So that means, on the one hand, states really should be using their existing tools in the regulatory toolbox. And in many respects, this doesn't need to be new legislation or new regulation, although in some cases that may be appropriate, but it's actually using the existing tools in a holistic way to take on the tech giants. So that's partly competition policy and economic regulation, but crucially not the kind of model of competition, neoliberal competition policy that's prevailed for the past 20, 30 years, but a broader perception of competition that actually takes in a wider set of objectives beyond just prices and the kind of consumer welfare standards. There are some positive signs that paradigm is shifting among competition regulators, but in the tech sector, this has to mean being much more robust in opening up these digital ecosystems through enforcing interoperability, splitting up the kind of vertical ecosystems and splitting off different parts of the tech companies. But it's not just going to be competition alone. I mean, I think it has to be, as I said, a holistic approach that takes in data protection enforcement, definitely tax. I think I completely agree with Abdul that that's a huge piece of the puzzle, where these big tech players have been getting away with not paying nearly enough tax and around the world, and that's really a mechanism that states should be using to also then fund the kind of proactive steps that they need to make. Enforcing labor rights is another part of it, but it's really looking across the board and taking a very coordinated approach. And then just finally, I think we have to take these kind of proactive steps to invest in an alternative vision through digital public infrastructure so that new open decentralized models are able to grow in their place. We have to not get sucked into the trap of the big tech companies' narrative that this is the way the internet has to be. It is not. There are other alternatives, and if the markets are leveled out and made fairer, then other alternatives are able to grow. And the only final thing I'll say is there has to be the right safeguards and governance structures in place to make sure that privacy, human rights, social justice are protected as these new forms and models are able to grow. So it's not just top down, but decentralized to enable the wide participation of people and groups in this dialogue.
Thank you very much, Joe. I would like to invite you, Henriette, but also fold in the brass tacks round, which is how do we get there, and what is a path that is more just. And with your vast experience, how do we harmonize coordination at the international level of the respective roles of the significant organs of the UN that have been doing a stupendous job to take us there in an extremely fraught environment? And what would you think is necessary for a new digital internationalism?
Anita, I mean, I think that the one thing that's important, both at a UN level, but also at a national and a regional level, I think we often forget in some parts of the world, regional collaboration is really important, like in Latin America and in Africa. I think we need to challenge this narrative that digitalization automatically supports greater economic equality and empowerment. And I think WSIS has taught us that the digitalization on its own can actually increase the divide, because as you have more sophisticated technologies, more application, more public services, more commercial services available online, those people who do not have the access, who cannot afford the data and don't have the devices, are even more excluded than they were prior to digitalization. So I think this narrative about digitalization equals development, and then also the narrative that increased wealth and increased economic growth and higher GDP growth equals development. We have to challenge that at a national level, international level. And I think that often developing countries are kind of duped or against their own better judgment buy into that narrative, because it becomes part of the investment and donor conversation. So I think the other thing linked at the same level of that narrative is we need to link WSIS and the SDGs. It was never really done. And I fear that the GDC process might also not do that. So we have to have that integrated approach, looking at sustainable development in its holistic way, holistic sense, as part of the integration and application of technology. Secondly, I think there's a need at a national and an international level to focus on at a very basic principle level on the publicness of digital infrastructure. Yes, the internet is a multi-stakeholder. It's owned, developed, managed by private sector, universities, governments. That doesn't mean that it's not an essential public infrastructure that should be governed as such. Doesn't mean that it's nationalized, but it means that the public interest principles should underpin even the multi-stakeholder, even the private sector, industry level governance of the internet. So I think we need to look at that, have a more creative approach to the multi-stakeholder, the idea of multi-stakeholder governance, make it more specific, make it more nuanced, but put public interest far more effectively at the center than we have succeeded thus far. And that brings me to regulation. And I think regulation definitely is part of that. Just to back on the basic principle, I think Neth said it. We have to really integrate human rights in a much more effective way. We have to do human rights impact assessments of innovation. The idea of permissionless innovation in the internet sector has had some good consequences, but it also has had lots of harmful consequences. And I think we now, with this preoccupation with AI, I'd much rather see less preoccupation with AI and more preoccupation of applying the precautionary principle to tech innovation in the way that we have in the pharmaceutical industry. Any tech innovation, not just AI-based innovation, should be put through human rights and social impact assessment due diligence processes. On market regulation, I think we have to look at the business models. I think I guess coming from Africa, the social media platforms are in some ways far less prominent for us than the MNOs, the multinational operators. Because if you look at percentage-wise, the number of people in Africa who use social media, it's still relatively low. But everyone needs to use the mobile phone. And those companies often have large shareholders, as governments are often large shareholders in those companies. So there's been a reluctance from governments to regulate them effectively, even at the most basic level, like making data affordable. So I think that regulation needs to be thought of both in terms of global companies, but also in terms of local companies. I think that Abdul is so right when he says that governments have powers within their jurisdiction that they are not applying effectively or creatively. And sometimes that might be because of lack of capacity. I think often it's because of self-interest as well, and lack of actually being accountable to their citizens effectively. But I think we have to look at business models. It's not only the US-based companies. The Chinese online traders are much bigger in Africa than Amazon is. But I think that Abdul's point about regulating tax and market in such a way that it diversifies the sectors is very important. I actually think that by diversifying and creating a more nuanced and granular digital economy at a national level, that will automatically shift the dominance of the global operators, and it can often be done by through tax. I also think there's I mean, to give you an example of Uber and labor regulation, Uber drivers in South Africa went to government. They marched in, and did a sit-in and a boycott actually in front of the Department of Labor, and they said to the South African government, regulate our labor. We are being treated unfairly by Uber. You have the power to regulate our labor work conditions. You can make the Basic Conditions of Employment Act apply to us. Nothing happened, simply because government failed to take action, and also because the union structure is such that those workers are not part of a national union. So again, I think that we can't just achieve justice by working from the multinational, from the international governance level to the national level. I actually think that more effective and more just governance at the national level will help us to achieve more justice at the global level. And then I think, you asked me to look at, I mean, there are more things about regulation. I would talk about data, for example. I think simple things like at the moment, the European DSA and DSM, the Digital Service and Digital Market Act, compels social media platforms to make data available to researchers and for academic purposes. That's not the case for researchers in other parts of the world. So there's, again, like a simple regulatory mechanism that could be done on soft and hard, but there is no reason why those companies should not be making their data available to researchers everywhere. So there are lots of actions like that we can take. And I think there is a need for a global framework that pins those principles of open access to data. And in fact, I think that it's interesting how the same people who champion the idea of the open internet do not like the idea of open data. So I think, again, there's a bit of a paradox there, that we need to look at the fact that so much data is held by these companies that is actually data that should be available in the public domain. And we're not working hard enough to get that. And then I think you asked about going forward. I think financing mechanisms, that Association for Progressive Communications, our current priority is financing for community-driven solutions, community-driven development of connectivity, community deployment of AI tools, of other contemporary digital development tools. And there's very little of that. The financing discussion is still really dominated by looking just at private sector investment, public-private partnership, loans. Tax is important, but we need mechanisms that will empower local communities as well. Sorry, that was long.
No, thank you very much. Over to you, Abdul, for your vision of the solutions. Yes.
Yeah. So again, building on what my co-panelists said, and again, building on the anecdote of Sri Lanka, And again, building on the point that the whole of the international tax regime is designed to restrict the power of source countries to tax foreign income. Sri Lanka was under tremendous pressure to accept the OECD's two-pillar solution, under tremendous pressure. But they said no, they were brave, as was Nigeria, as was Kenya, as was Pakistan, the 4 countries which rejected the two-pillar solution, each of whom was under tremendous pressure. And they said, we'll go ahead and implement our own solutions on these largely US tech firms. So now, as I said, other European countries have also done it, have been threatened by American trade sanctions, and recently came to some compromise agreements. But this is the first thing which all of us can do as global South countries. But this is actually, since, as I said, big tech is largely US big tech, even most of the developed countries are on the same board with us. All the developing countries are encouraged strongly to immediately commence unilateral digital tax measures on tech, on digital services, in particular, given 2 developments. One, the endless extension of the OECD negotiations for taxing the digital economy, direct taxes. So these are taxes paid by the corporations. And the second is the endless extension of the e-commerce moratorium in the WTO. But again, here the tax is not paid by the corporation, it's paid by the importer. But both are taxes on digital services, but in slightly different ways. So what the global north wants is to keep talking endlessly, don't do anything. So let's stop playing this game. Let's stop wasting our time. Let's stop ruining the lives of our people more than we have to, and immediately commence with unilateral digital tax measures. Next slide, please. Now, how to do it in terms of options? The most, now I'm going to talk purely about direct taxes, which are paid by the corporations. So these are taxes which would be paid by Google, by Amazon, by Facebook. The most commonly used option is digital service taxes, which is also what the European countries have used. And how it works is very simple. I'll give you a very, very simple example. Let's say you buy something from Amazon and you pay $100. And your country, let's, for example, France, I think has a 3% DST. So if a French person buys something from Amazon for $100, Amazon would get only $97 in its pocket, because the $3 would be withheld as a tax. So that's essentially how it works. Every payment that is made, a certain portion is withheld as a tax and kept in the pocket of the government, and the rest of it is collected by goes to the corporation. So that's basically how it works, and it's simple to administer, and they have generated lots of money. India collected $500 million in 2021. That's the most recent data we have. Other options which countries have, one is called significant economic presence, and I have 4 minutes, so I'm not going to go into it, but I'm happy to discuss bilaterally. And the other one is called Article 12B, which is a treaty-based option of the UN Model Tax Convention. Next slide, please. Now, there's a talk of an emerging approach to a multilateral approach to digital service taxes, especially given the highly probable failure of Amount A, given American obstinacy and obstructionism. So there's a talk of a coordinated approach to digital service taxes. Now, this is again another multilateral thing which will take forever. So I want to mention that you don't need to wait for this. You can immediately start with domestic options, start collecting the money in your pocket. And treaty-based options, the developed countries always say, oh, you need a tax treaty. You need a treaty-based option. Otherwise, there'll be double taxation. Okay, there might be double taxation. But one, the reality is most developed countries have provisions in their tax code to give unilateral relief in case there's no tax treaty. So double taxation can be solved even without a treaty. And most developed countries have provisions in their domestic law to solve this. And the second thing is that if there's double taxation, it will mainly affect the corporation. The corporation will face double taxation. So the developing countries have nothing to lose. It's the corporation which will face double taxation. And another point is made that, oh, the tax will be passed on to the consumers. This again goes back to the point on protectionism. If the tax is passed on to the consumers, that means the service providers' products become more expensive and they become less competitive, and there is a preference towards your domestic service providers. So this is actually good for our domestic companies if they pass on the cost to the consumers. So this is something most of the tech companies are aware of, and that is why in almost none of the cases where digital service taxes have been implemented have the costs been actually passed on to the consumers. So this is an empty threat, which we should be very aware of. Next slide, please. And the last point is, well, the last 2 points I'm going to very quickly finish. How do we stop or reduce the wealth accumulation of the big tech barons? The United Nations in last month, in fact, has approved guidance for taxing net wealth at the 28th session of the UN Tax Committee. The link is in the chat. This is something which any country can use to design its own net wealth taxes. Please use them if you're interested, and please share them with anybody with any country which you think would be interested. And this is especially welcome given Brazil's call for a global minimum wealth tax on the billionaires. Next slide, please. And the last point which I would like to make is that ultimately, if we want fair international tax rules, they cannot come from the OECD, because the OECD is a country of the rich and the developed countries, where the developing countries have no real power. There can never be fair rules as long as the process of rule making remains unfair. And in this situation, as a South Center, we have strongly supported the historic achievement by the developing world led by Africa to begin a negotiation on a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. This can redesign the international tax architecture to make it fairer for developing countries. And we strongly call on all developing countries and even the developed countries to support this, because as I mentioned, many of the corporations are not paying anything even to the developed countries themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you, Joe and Neth, for joining us. We are just on time. And yesterday, somebody mentioned in one of the sessions I attended that we want the digital society and economy to work for the 8 billion people out there, not the 8 billionaires. So on that note of optimism, and thank you for the concrete suggestions, we will call the session to a close.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.